onto that issue shortly, but let's talk about the economy now. And the figures this week, 10% growth in Queensland and WA, recession conditions really in South Australia and Tasmania, and very low growth figures in New South Wales and Victoria. Let's hear from Wayne Swan now and his analysis of how he reads the figures.
In ordinary times, this would be seen as a soft number, but the last 3 months of last year were far from ordinary. This is quite a solid number in the circumstances, and I believe it is one of the dividends of getting the big economic calls right. There is nothing in these numbers that deters the government from bringing down a surplus in 2012-13, although obviously this makes that task more difficult.
How much more difficult?
How much more difficult? We're going to break down that comment. The December quarter of 2011 could well have been, when we look back on it, the high point of GFC Mark II, because things have improved a little bit. The Greeks have just executed the world's greatest debt swap in history and may actually muddle through for another few months. The US economy is coming good, but Wayne Swan looks at that number and the first thing that goes in his head, well, it's subpar growth, it's below trend. I think the annual growth rate is about 2.3% going into the end of last year, and if you do it on a 6-month basis and then double it to get an annualised growth for the last 6 months, it's about 2.4. Our trend growth is 3.25, and that's the point at which budget cuts are supposed to kick in. So he's below trend, so he's got a difficulty explaining to the Australian electorate why it is he's still rushing to surplus when the economy is soft. Now, my understanding of fiscal policy is it should always lean against the cycle. So in good times, you take a bit of money out of the economy so the government isn't competing with the private sector. In bad times, when the private sector is closing its wallet, you step in there to soften the fall.
And in the big states, that's what's required right now.
Well, I mean, Victoria and New South Wales are still roughly half the national economy, or a bit over half the national economy combined, and they are growing at below trend, whichever way you look at those numbers. And you want to be cutting in Melbourne and Sydney? Simply to make room for even bigger growth in Brisbane and Perth? Well, that doesn't make that much sense to me. Look, but more importantly, and I don't want to overcomplicate this because I didn't bring a graph with me, and we can't do a graph today. But what they're planning to do to get to surplus, between the financial year we're just in and the financial year ahead, what they're planning to do to get to surplus with an economy growing below trend would require the biggest fiscal tightening in history from one year to the next. Now, it may happen, but it may also smash the economy.
It makes for one hell of an interesting May budget. And on the other side of politics, of course, it suggests that you really don't pass on potential revenue-raising ideas either, like the mining tax.
Or the carbon tax.
And you've got to be very careful about where you spend your money. And, of course, whenever that comes up, the parental leave scheme comes up. Let's hear Tony Abbott again on that, and he's not backing away.
I've got to say that, as far as I'm concerned, this is an absolute signature policy. It is an absolute signature policy. It is going to be one of the defining marks of my leadership of the coalition.
Have you brought Andrew Robb into line yet?
Look, Andrew fully supports it. All of my front bench colleagues fully support it.
All right, no dramas then with the party. No. Everyone's in a line. OK, let's talk about...
And they do fully support it because they know he's not budging on it.
Particularly after a swift kick from the muscular Mr Abbott.
But then it raises very interesting situations like this where the opposition is reminded of economic responsibility from unlikely places.
Of all the people in the world, Natasha, I would have thought you would be there advocating the very best outcome for working women. And
I do.
Go on.
I do advocate the best outcome, but I'm also someone who believes in being economically sensible.
But now, this audit, is that what this is about then, Gerard? This is Tony Abbott now trying to change the conversation and talk about this ability that he has to have a look at every aspect of spending right across the board.
Well, the audit makes a lot of sense. John Howard did it in 1996 and it worked. And Tony Abbott's trying to present himself as someone who would follow John Howard. So I think that makes a lot of sense. We've got to bear in mind, a lot of commentators forget, there are 2 budgets to go before the next election, which is due around August 2013. It's a long time. You can't expect the opposition to be firing off specific statements about what they would do when there are still 2 budgets to go and we don't know what Labor's going to do yet. I mean, will Labor do what George hints at what George says it has to do, or will it do something else? That's just for next May, we don't know. As for May 2013, we have absolutely no idea, and nor does Tony Abbott.
But what this week was about is actually a change in the way that we automatically look at our economic circumstances. I mean, Martin Parkinson's speech was kind of a bit of a watershed in that sense. We stop looking at our economy as one where the terms of trade will get us through no matter what political decisions are made. I mean, Kevin Rudd started having this conversation when he launched his campaign in 2007. Remember where that crazy Queensland gathering where he said this reckless spending's got to stop, and everybody hysterically cheered him as he promised to run a knife through kind of social spending. And then, but he'd just signed up to $33 billion of income tax cuts, which was to match the Howard Costello promise, and which has changed the face of the budget over the intervening 4 years. This week is about readjusting expectations to this being now a permanent state of affairs where you can't rely on the terms of trade to just keep propping up the Australian economy.
And the point Martin Parkinson made, and partisans will say that the deficit equals government spending. The deficit is not government spending. It's been the collapse in revenues since the GFC. Now, the unemployment rate may be at close to full employment, i.e. 5% before it starts to accelerate inflation. But the budget is in a recession-like deficit because revenue has collapsed. Now, the big problem, and this is Kevin Rudd owns this as much as Peter Costello and John Howard own this. In the sort of 5 years leading up to the 2007 election, when the mining boom, the first phase of the mining boom came in, pretty much every dollar in excess revenue was handed back to the electorate. Now, it didn't seem like a problem in 2007 when you were reporting a headline budget surplus of $20 billion, but you get a deficit of $50 billion the very next year after the GFC hits. The stimulus is only $20 billion of that. The $50 billion is the collapse in revenues. And all the way through the life of this government, they've had a difficulty explaining this to the Australian people, that basically we both, Labor and Liberal, assumed that this party was going to go on forever. When the party stopped and our income clock was reset by the rest of the world, we ended up going back to 2002, 2003 styled budgets, but with favours built in based on the windfalls. So look, for both sides of politics, this is tricky time. Now, I'm going to give you a wild idea here, and because we're in a minority government, the coalition should be nominating spending cuts now, because the coalition and Labor share A, the goal of reducing the size of government, and B, they both want to land a disability insurance scheme. Tony Abbott also has his circular transactions to fund paid parental leave. Now, a couple of cuts from the coalition now ahead of the budget, sensible cuts. If Labor owns them, Labor is not going to get a bump in news poll for having done it, but the coalition can set themselves up for government. Yep. This idea of the audit sounds fine on paper, but it actually doesn't work for me, because what's changed since 1996 is the Charter of Budget Honesty. So both sides of politics know there's going to be no post-election surprises. So if you want to be a good government, you want to get your cuts up now.
You've just written a book called The Australian Moment, which praises Bob Hawke for good reason. He was a good Prime Minister. Hawke went to the 1983 election and he said, throw away your calculators. Yeah. That was his policy. Throw away your calculators and come follow me. He had no plans to cut anything, and he was a very effective Prime Minister. So why put a different demand on Tony?
Right, because the Charter of Budget Honesty has changed that. Hawke came out of the 1983 election with a blowout in the deficit. That's why he cancelled all his promises the day after.